They called it protection. A marriage certificate signed in the territorial governor's office, binding a woman who'd committed no crime to a man who'd asked for nothing. But protection was just another word for control, and the real genius of the system wasn't in what it forbade. It was in who would pay the price when rules were broken. Fort Defiance, Arizona Territory, 1877. 3 days after the Apache scout known as Neshoba brought in the renegade war party that had been raiding supply trains, he learned his reward would be a wife. Major Thornton delivered the news in his office at the fort, windows open to let in air that did nothing to cool the suffocating heat of late summer. The Indian Commissioner has approved a new initiative. Selected scouts who demonstrate exceptional loyalty will be paired with civilian women. Widows, orphans, those without male protection. It benefits everyone. The women gain security, you gain status, the government gains proof that cooperation leads to prosperity. Neshoba stood perfectly still, his cavalry-issue shirt stiff with dried sweat, his hands loose at his sides. He'd learned long ago that stillness was safety when white officers made pronouncements. I did not request a wife. Nevertheless, arrangements have been made, Thornton replied. He pushed a photograph across the desk. A young white woman, pale hair pulled back, eyes that looked past the camera toward something the viewer couldn't see. Her name is Margaret Cole, 23 years old. Her father died in the Sonora silver mines, her mother shortly after. She's been working as a seamstress at the fort, but her position is tenuous. Questions have been raised about her conduct. What questions? Thornton's expression suggested the details didn't matter. The kind that destroy reputations. This marriage solves her problem and provides the commissioner with a successful example of integration. The ceremony is scheduled for Saturday. Neshoba looked at the photograph again. At the woman whose life was apparently as disposable as his own. And if I refuse? Then your scouting contract is terminated. Your access to the fort, to supplies, to the protection of being classified as friendly, all of it ends. And Miss Cole's situation resolves itself in ways that won't be pleasant for her. Thornton leaned back in his chair. Or you can accept that this is how progress works. You've already adapted. You wear our uniforms, speak our language, track your own people for our benefit. This is simply the next step. The manipulation was elegant. Refuse and prove himself unreliable, ungrateful, dangerous. Accept and become a living example that Apache could be civilized through proximity to whiteness. Either way, Major Thornton won. When do I meet her? Neshoba asked. Saturday, Thornton repeated. At the ceremony. There's no need for courtship when the outcome is already determined. What Thornton didn't mention, what he'd carefully concealed from Neshoba, was that Margaret Cole hadn't agreed to anything either. She'd been informed of her new future the same way, with a photograph and a threat. Margaret had been summoning the courage to leave the fort entirely, to take what little money she'd saved and disappear into one of the mining towns where single women could vanish into anonymity. But Mrs. Thornton, the major's wife, had intercepted her 2 days earlier in the officers' quarters where Margaret did mending work. I have wonderful news, Mrs. Thornton had said, in that bright voice she used when delivering terrible information. Major Thornton has arranged a marriage for you, to one of our Apache scouts, a man named Neshoba, very reliable, very cooperative. It's quite an honor, really. Margaret's needle had stilled against the fabric. I don't want to marry anyone. Want is such a luxury, dear, Mrs. Thornton replied. What you need is protection, security, a position that can't be questioned. She'd leaned closer, voice dropping. I know about the letters. The ones you've been sending to that newspaper in Tucson. The ones describing conditions at the fort, criticizing treatment of the Apache prisoners, questioning the commissioner's policies. Margaret's blood had gone cold. She'd been so careful. Used false names. Mailed them from town rather than the fort. Did you think we wouldn't notice? Mrs. Thornton continued. That we wouldn't intercept correspondence that could damage the fort's reputation? You've been writing sedition, Margaret. Criticism of government policy. If that became public, if charges were brought, well, you'd be ruined, possibly imprisoned. Those letters told the truth. Truth is treason when it contradicts official narrative, Mrs. Thornton said. But Major Thornton is willing to overlook your indiscretion if you cooperate with this marriage. You'll become the responsibility of your Apache husband. Your conduct will reflect on him, and he's far too valuable as a scout to risk through association with a troublemaker. The mechanism clicked into place. Margaret wouldn't be punished directly for speaking truth. Her husband would be. Every word she wrote, every criticism she voiced, every act of defiance would cost him his position, his safety, his standing with the only people who could protect him from being reclassified as hostile. They never told her to be quiet. They just taught her what silence would cost him. Saturday, Mrs. Thornton said. Wear something appropriate. We'll want photographs for the commissioner's report. The ceremony took place in the fort's chapel, attended by a dozen officers and their wives who'd come to witness the experiment. Margaret wore a borrowed dress that smelled of another woman's perfume. Neshoba wore his scout uniform, the blue wool suffocating in the Arizona heat. The chaplain rushed through the service. Neither bride nor groom spoke, except when directly prompted. Margaret looked at the man she was being bound to, and saw only careful blankness, the expression of someone who'd learned to hide everything that mattered. Neshoba looked at the woman who'd agreed to this arrangement and saw someone calculating, opportunistic, someone willing to use him for her own advancement. Both of them were wrong. Neither of them knew it yet. The cabin they were assigned sat at the edge of the Apache quarters, a deliberate placement that isolated them from both communities. Not quite part of the fort proper, not quite part of the Apache camp, a middle ground that satisfied no one. Major Thornton visited that evening, his presence filling the small space with the weight of authority. I want to be clear about expectations, he said, looking primarily at Margaret. Your husband is a valuable asset to this fort. His knowledge of Apache movements, his ability to track renegades, his cooperation with our objectives, these make him indispensable, which means his reputation must be protected. Protected from what? Margaret asked. From association with seditious behavior, Thornton replied. Your previous activities, those letters, those criticisms, they stop now, completely. If any further correspondence appears questioning fort policy, if any whispers of discontent are traced back to this household, Neshoba's position will be terminated. He'll be stripped of scout status and reclassified as a prisoner of war. Do you understand what that means? Margaret understood. Prisoners of war were kept in the stockade, given minimal rations, denied freedom of movement. Prisoners died of disease, of despair, of the slow, grinding cruelty of confinement. I understand, she said quietly. Excellent. Thornton turned to Neshoba. And you understand that your wife's conduct is now your responsibility? That any problems she creates become your problems? I understand, Neshoba replied, his English precise and empty of inflection. Good. Then we shouldn't have any difficulties. Thornton smiled. Congratulations on your marriage. May it be long and prosperous. After he left, Margaret and Neshoba stood in separate corners of the cabin, the space between them charged with resentment and mistrust. You wanted this, Neshoba said finally. Wanted the security of marriage to someone the fort considers useful. I wanted nothing, Margaret replied. I was told I would marry you or face charges for criticism of government policy. Neshoba's expression shifted slightly. They told me you agreed willingly, that you requested this arrangement. And they told me you petitioned for a white wife, that you saw marriage to me as advancement. Understanding dawned slowly, cold as winter rain. They'd both been manipulated, lied to, forced into this bond through carefully constructed falsehoods that made each see the other as opportunist rather than fellow victim. Why? Margaret asked. What does Thornton gain from forcing us together? Neshoba moved to the window, looking out at the fort's evening routines. Control over you through me. You write letters criticizing the fort. The government wants those letters to stop, but imprisoning a white woman for speaking truth would attract attention from reformers back east. So instead, they marry you to someone whose position depends on your silence. Now when you write, I suffer. When you speak, I'm punished. They never have to touch you directly. And you? Margaret asked. What do they gain from your side? Proof that cooperation leads to reward, Neshoba replied. I'm the model Apache. I wear their uniform, track my own people, follow their orders. Now I have a white wife, live in this cabin, participate in their version of civilization. I'm their demonstration that Apache can be domesticated, that resistance is unnecessary when integration offers such benefits. Benefits, Margaret repeated bitterly. Is that what this is? This is a cage, Neshoba said. Well-designed and inescapable. And we are both trapped inside it. They established routines built on careful distance. Neshoba left before dawn most mornings, scouting or tracking or performing whatever duties the fort demanded. Margaret continued her seamstress work, mending uniforms and officers' clothing, the monotonous stitching giving her time to think about words she could no longer write. The letters had been her resistance, her way of documenting the truth about what happened at Fort Defiance. The way Apache prisoners were starved on inadequate rations while warehouses remained full. The way children were separated from families and sent to boarding schools designed to destroy their culture. The way scouts like Neshoba were forced to hunt their own relatives, tracking down those who'd refused to surrender. She'd sent those letters to newspapers, to reform organizations, to anyone who might care. And now she couldn't. Because every word she wrote would be paid for in her husband's suffering. 2 weeks into the marriage, Margaret made her first mistake, not intentional, just a moment of unguarded honesty in the wrong place. She'd been working in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, hemming curtains, when the officer's wife began complaining about the Indian problem. How the Apache were ungrateful for government generosity. How they resisted civilization out of pure stubbornness. How the sooner they all died out or learned to behave, the better. Margaret's hands had stilled on the fabric. Perhaps they resist because they're being robbed of everything they have. The words were out before she could stop them. Mrs. Patterson had stared at her with a mixture of shock and satisfaction, the look of someone who'd just won an argument they didn't know they were having. How interesting, Mrs. Patterson said coldly, that you defend savages over your own people. I wonder if Major Thornton knows how his generosity in arranging your marriage has been repaid. Margaret had left immediately, but the damage was done. That evening, Neshoba returned to the cabin with a split lip and bruised knuckles. What happened? Margaret asked, reaching for a cloth. Major Thornton heard about your comments to Mrs. Patterson, Neshoba replied, pulling away from her attempt to clean the wound. He wanted to make clear that my wife's opinions reflect poorly on my loyalty, that if I can't control what you say, perhaps I'm not as cooperative as the fort requires. He hit you? He had Lieutenant Harrison do it, Neshoba corrected. Thornton never dirties his own hands. But the message was clear. Your words have consequences. For me. Margaret felt sick. I'm sorry. I didn't think. You didn't have to think, Neshoba interrupted. That's the brilliance of their system. You react naturally, speak honestly, defend what you believe is right. And I pay the price. They've made you into a weapon against me without you even trying. He was right. And the worst part was that silence felt like betrayal too. Every time she heard lies about the Apache, every time she witnessed injustice and said nothing, she was complicit. But every time she spoke truth, her husband suffered. There was no winning, only choosing which form of defeat to accept. I'll be more careful, Margaret said quietly. Careful isn't enough, Neshoba replied. You need to be invisible, silent, the model wife who never questions, never challenges, never makes anyone uncomfortable with truth. And if I can't be that, then we both lose. Margaret began to understand the architecture of her cage. It wasn't built from locked doors or armed guards. It was built from responsibility, from the knowledge that her freedom cost someone else their safety. Every impulse to write, to speak, to resist, had to be weighed against what it would cost Neshoba. Every moment of silence was purchased with guilt. Every word spoken was paid for in his pain. The system required no active enforcement. She policed herself because the alternative was unconscionable. But silence was its own kind of death. and Margaret had never been good at accepting death quietly. She started small. In her seamstress work, she'd occasionally accidentally overhear conversations between officers, discussions about supply distribution, about plans for Apache relocation, about policies designed to starve cooperation into existence. She began documenting these conversations in code, in the margins of dress patterns and the backs of supply lists. Nothing that could be identified as sedition. Just careful records of truth, waiting for some future moment when they might matter. Neshoba noticed the changes in her. The way she'd return from officers' homes with patterns covered in small notations. The way she'd spend evenings staring at fabric scraps like they held secrets. "What are you doing?" he asked one night. Margaret looked up from a piece of muslin covered in seemingly random marks. "Recording." "Recording what?" "Everything they say when they think I'm not listening," Margaret replied. "All the things they'd deny if questioned directly. Proof that their official reports lie about rations, about conditions, about how they treat Apache prisoners." "To what purpose?" Neshoba asked. "You can't send letters. You can't publish these records. All you're doing is creating evidence of your own disobedience." "I'm creating testimony," Margaret corrected, "for when the moment comes that someone is actually willing to listen. That moment won't come." "Maybe not," Margaret agreed. "But if it does, I'll be ready." Neshoba studied her for a long moment. "You're going to get us both killed." "I'm going to get truth preserved," Margaret replied. "Even if no one sees it in our lifetime. Even if it costs everything. Because the alternative is letting them erase what's happening here, and I won't do that." She expected anger, expected him to forbid her, to destroy the records, to protect himself by ending her small rebellion. Instead, Neshoba sat down across from her. "Show me," he said. "Show you what?" "Your code. Your system." He gestured at the marked fabric. "If you're going to document truth, do it properly. I can tell you things you'd never overhear in officers' parlors. Numbers from the stockade. Names of Apache who've died from deliberate neglect. Details about supply theft that even Thornton thinks are secret." Margaret stared at him. "Why would you help me? Every risk I take becomes your risk." "Because you're right," Neshoba said. "Someone needs to preserve what's happening here. And perhaps—" He paused. "Perhaps I'm tired of survival without dignity. Of cooperating with my own destruction because the alternative is worse. You're willing to resist, even when it costs you. Maybe I should be too." It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Not love, not yet. But partnership. Alliance built on shared purpose rather than forced proximity. They developed a system. Margaret would document what she learned from her work in officers' homes. Neshoba would add information from his access to the Apache sections of the fort, the stockade, the supply warehouses. They'd record everything in code on fabric scraps that could be hidden, burned if necessary, reconstructed if lost. It was dangerous. If discovered, Margaret would face charges for sedition. Neshoba would be reclassified as hostile, imprisoned, possibly killed. But the work felt necessary in ways that simple survival never had. And slowly, through the shared risk and careful trust, something else developed. Margaret learned to read Neshoba's silences, to understand what he couldn't say directly. Neshoba learned to interpret Margaret's careful word choices, the things she implied rather than stated. They became fluent in each other's unspoken language. 3 months into the marriage, Major Thornton summoned them both to his office. "I've been reviewing reports," Thornton said, looking between them with an expression Margaret couldn't read. "Your behavior has been exemplary. Margaret, I've heard nothing but praise for your seamstress work. Neshoba, your scouting continues to be invaluable. You've both become exactly what the commissioner hoped for. Proof that integration benefits everyone." Margaret felt cold. This wasn't praise. This was setup. "Which is why," Thornton continued, "I'm sending you both to Washington. There's a delegation of reformers visiting next month. Eastern philanthropists who want to see evidence that our Indian policies are humane and effective. You'll be Exhibit A, the Apache scout and his white wife, building a successful life together, demonstrating that cooperation leads to prosperity." "We can't leave the fort," Neshoba said. My scouting duties can be temporarily suspended, Thornton interrupted. This is more important. The commissioner specifically requested you. Refused to accept substitutes. Apparently, your reputation as a model of successful integration has reached Washington. Margaret's mind raced. A trip to Washington meant access to the reformers Thornton mentioned. Access to newspapers, to organizations that might actually care about the truth she and Neshoba had been documenting. But it also meant performing for an audience, selling the lie of successful integration to people who wanted to believe cooperation was the answer. What exactly would we be required to do? She asked carefully. Attend dinners, answer questions. Let yourselves be observed and photographed. Demonstrate that an Apache man and a white woman can build a life together through the government's enlightened policies. Thornton smiled. Simple, really. Just be yourselves. Except they couldn't be themselves. They had to be the fiction Thornton had created. Grateful beneficiaries of government generosity rather than prisoners of an elegant cage. And if we refuse? Neshoba asked. Thornton's expression hardened. Then I'll have to question whether you're truly as cooperative as I believed. Whether perhaps your loyalty has been compromised. And we both know what happens to scouts whose loyalty is in doubt. The threat was clear. Perform for Washington or face reclassification. There was no real choice. We'll go, Margaret said. Excellent. Thornton stood. You leave in 2 weeks. Mrs. Thornton will help Margaret prepare appropriate clothing. Neshoba, you'll need to perfect your presentation. The commissioner wants you impressive but not threatening. Civilized, but still recognizably Apache. It's a delicate balance. After they left Thornton's office, Margaret and Neshoba walked back to their cabin in tense silence. He's sending us to Washington to be displayed like trophies, Neshoba said finally. He's sending us to Washington where we'll have access to people who might actually listen, Margaret countered. To reformers and journalists and politicians who aren't invested in maintaining the fiction. And how do we reach them without Thornton noticing? He'll be watching every moment. Then we need to be very careful, Margaret replied. And very smart. This might be the only chance we get to make our documentation matter. Over the next 2 weeks, they prepared on 2 levels. Publicly, they rehearsed the roles Thornton demanded. The grateful Apache scout and his devoted wife. Evidence of successful integration. Privately, they organized their hidden records, translating the coded fabric scraps into coherent testimony that could be quickly conveyed to the right listeners. Margaret visited Mrs. Thornton to select appropriate dresses for Washington. The major's wife circled her like a predator, adjusting hems and necklines with sharp, efficient movements. You'll need to be careful in Washington, Mrs. Thornton said as she pinned a sleeve. The reformers are sympathetic to Indians, but suspicious of white women who marry them. They'll be watching for any sign that you were coerced or corrupted. Your job is to convince them you're happy, fulfilled, and grateful for the opportunity this marriage provided. And if I can't convince them? Margaret asked. Then their report will recommend investigating whether the integration program is actually beneficial or merely exploitative, Mrs. Thornton replied. Which would be unfortunate for everyone, including your husband, whose position depends on the program's success. Another threat wrapped in courtesy. Margaret was becoming expert at recognizing them. The journey to Washington took 3 weeks by rail. Thornton accompanied them, along with 2 other Apache scouts being showcased as success stories, though neither of those men had been given white wives. Neshoba was the special case, the demonstration that integration could go so far as to blur the lines between civilization and savagery. During the train journey, Margaret watched the landscape change from desert to prairie to the green density of the East. She'd never been this far from home. Her entire life had been contained within the territories. Washington felt like another world entirely. They arrived to a city of monuments and bureaucracy, where everyone moved with purpose and confidence born from never having questioned whether the systems they served were just. Margaret felt like a fraud walking its streets, wearing borrowed silk while carrying documentation of the government's crimes hidden in her carpetbag. The demonstrations began immediately. Thornton paraded them through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, through dinners with congressional committees, through carefully staged meetings with reform organizations. Everywhere they went, the same questions. Was the marriage happy? Did Neshoba feel his cooperation had been rewarded? Was Margaret content with her unique position? They performed brilliantly. Neshoba spoke of gratitude for the opportunity to serve as scout, of respect for the government's wisdom in providing integration pathways. Margaret described the satisfaction of helping her husband navigate civilization, of seeing him embrace education and advancement. They were exactly what the commissioner wanted. Living proof that Indians could be saved through proximity to whiteness. And every word was ash in Margaret's mouth. But on the third evening in Washington, opportunity arrived. A reception at a reform organization's headquarters, attended by journalists and philanthropists and genuine believers in Indian rights. Thornton was there, watching, but he couldn't monitor every conversation in the crowded room. Margaret found herself briefly separated from Neshoba, standing near a window with a woman who'd introduced herself as Catherine Whitmore, from the Friends of the Indian Society. "Your husband seems remarkably well adapted," Catherine said. "Major Thornton tells us he's one of the most successful scouts at Fort Defiance." "He's very skilled," Margaret agreed carefully. "And you're happy? Truly happy in this arrangement?" Margaret met the woman's eyes. This was the moment. Speak truth and risk everything, or maintain the fiction and preserve their precarious safety. "May I ask you a question?" Margaret said quietly. "If you discovered that everything you'd been told about the integration program was a lie, would you want to know the truth? Even if that truth was uncomfortable?" Catherine's expression shifted from polite interest to sharp attention. "What kind of truth?" "The kind that gets people imprisoned if they speak it openly," Margaret replied. She glanced around, confirming Thornton was occupied across the room. "The kind documented in fabric code because paper records would be confiscated. The kind my husband and I have been preserving for 3 months because someone needs to remember what actually happens at Fort Defiance." "That's quite an accusation." "It's quite a crime," Margaret said. "And if you're genuinely interested in reforming Indian policy rather than just congratulating yourselves on theoretical progress, I can provide evidence." Catherine studied her for a long moment. "How do I know you're not simply a disgruntled employee trying to cause trouble?" "Because I have nothing to gain and everything to lose," Margaret replied. "If Thornton discovers I've spoken to you, my husband will be imprisoned, and I'll face charges for sedition. But the alternative is letting the lies continue unchallenged, and I can't do that anymore." "Where is this evidence?" "In my room, coated on fabric scraps that look like seamstress work. It will take time to translate, but it documents supply theft, deliberate starvation, forced labor, separation of families, all the things the official reports claim aren't happening." Catherine's face had gone very still. "If what you're saying is true, this is explosive. It could undermine the entire Bureau of Indian Affairs." "If what I'm saying is true, the Bureau deserves to be undermined," Margaret replied. "The question is whether you're willing to listen to truth that contradicts comfortable assumptions." Before Catherine could respond, Thornton appeared at Margaret's elbow. "Mrs. Neshoba, your husband is looking for you." The interruption was deliberate. Thornton had noticed the intense conversation, grown suspicious. Margaret gave Catherine a look that she hoped conveyed urgency, then allowed Thornton to guide her away. That night, lying in the hotel room she shared with Neshoba, separate beds, always separate beds despite the marriage certificate, Margaret whispered what had happened. "You spoke to a reformer," Neshoba said quietly. "Directly." "I had to. This is our chance." "It's also a trap," Neshoba replied. "Thornton is watching. He knows something happened. If that woman comes to your room tomorrow, if she asks for evidence, it will confirm his suspicions." "Then we need to give her evidence before he can intervene," Margaret said. They worked through the night by candlelight, translating the most damning pieces of documentation into clear English. Supply manifests showing theft. Lists of Apache who died from inadequate rations. Testimony about forced labor and family separation. Everything organized into a packet that could be quickly conveyed and quickly hidden. At dawn, there was a soft knock on their door. Margaret opened it to find Catherine Whitmore, alone, with an expression of determined purpose. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Catherine said. "If you're willing to share that evidence, I'm willing to ensure it reaches people who can act on it." Margaret handed her the translated packet. This represents 3 months of careful documentation. Names, dates, numbers. Everything verifiable if anyone actually investigates. But if Major Thornton learns I gave this to you, he won't learn it from me, Catherine interrupted. And I'll ensure my sources remain confidential. You have my word. After she left, Neshoba stood at the window, watching the Washington street come to life with morning traffic. We've committed now. No going back. Was there ever a going back? Margaret asked. No, Neshoba admitted. I suppose there wasn't. The rest of the Washington visit proceeded with agonizing normalcy. More dinners, more demonstrations, more performances of successful integration. But Margaret felt the weight of what they'd done, the evidence now in Catherine Whitmore's hands, circulating to journalists and reformers and people who might actually force change. On their last evening in Washington, Thornton summoned them to his hotel room. I know what you did, he said without preamble. I don't know exactly what you told that reformer woman, but I saw her visiting your room. I know evidence was exchanged. Margaret's heart hammered, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult my intelligence, Thornton snapped. You think I haven't been watching, waiting for you to make exactly this mistake? He turned to Neshoba. And you? I expected better loyalty from you. After everything the fort has done to protect you, to give you status. You've done nothing but use me, Neshoba interrupted, his careful restraint finally breaking. Scout for you or be imprisoned. Marry this woman or be reclassified as hostile. Come to Washington and perform or face consequences. Where in any of that was protection? Where? Thornton repeated, his voice dangerous. How about the fact that you're not dead? That you're not starving in the stockade like the ones who refuse to cooperate? Protection doesn't mean comfort, Scout. It means survival. And you've just thrown it away. What are you going to do? Margaret asked. If you charge us with sedition, with speaking to reformers, you'll have to explain what truth we told that was so dangerous. The very investigation you're trying to prevent will happen anyway. Thornton's expression was murderous. You think you're clever, but there are ways to destroy people without formal charges. Ways that leave no evidence, no martyrs for the reform societies to champion. Then do it, Neshoba said. We're finished performing for you. For a moment, Margaret thought Thornton might actually resort to violence. Then he smiled, cold and utterly without humor. Oh, I'm not going to destroy you, he said. I'm going to let the system do it naturally. You'll return to Fort Defiance. You'll continue your marriage, your work, your lives. But I'll make certain everyone knows you're troublemakers, that you speak against government policy, that you undermine authority, and slowly, gradually, all your access will disappear. Margaret, you'll lose your seamstress positions. Neshoba, you'll find scouting assignments drying up. Your rations will be reduced to minimum allowable levels. Your cabin will need repairs that never come. You'll be isolated, impoverished, and helpless, and it will all be completely legal. No charges, no dramatic persecution, just the slow grind of bureaucratic punishment until you either submit or die quietly. It was worse than imprisonment, more terrifying than any quick violence. It was the promise of death by 1,000 administrative cuts. Unless, Thornton continued, you're willing to cooperate going forward. Recant whatever you told that reformer. Write a statement praising the integration program. Become my active agents instead of my passive victims. Do that, and I'll forget your little rebellion. You'll return to your previous status, protected and useful. Margaret looked at Neshoba, saw in his eyes the same calculation she was making. How much more suffering they could endure, how long they could survive systematic destruction, whether principles were worth dying for. No, Margaret said finally. We're finished cooperating with lies. Then you're finished everything, Thornton replied. Enjoy the train ride home. It will be the last comfort you experience for a very long time. They returned to Fort Defiance in early autumn, when the desert heat finally began to break. True to Thornton's promise, the persecution was subtle and systematic. Margaret lost her seamstress positions, officers' wives suddenly discovering concerns about the quality of her work. Neshoba's scouting assignments dwindled until he was assigned only the most menial tasks: repairing fences, hauling supplies, work that required no skill and offered no status. Their rations were reduced to bare subsistence. The cabin developed leaks that maintenance crews ignored. Small humiliations accumulated daily, being kept waiting for supplies that should have been routine, finding their requests for basic necessities denied, watching other Apache families receive resources that were withheld from them. And through it all, the knowledge that they could end the persecution with a single statement of recantation. Just say the integration program was wonderful, that Thornton was benevolent, that they were grateful. Just lie convincingly enough, and survival would be possible again. Neither of them could do it. "We're going to starve," Margaret said one evening, looking at the meager supplies they'd been allocated for the week. "Then we starve with dignity," Neshoba replied. But his face was drawn, his body beginning to show the effects of inadequate food and relentless labor. Margaret felt the weight of it. The surveillance contract they'd been bound by finally collecting its price. Every word she'd spoken against Thornton's lies was being paid for in Neshoba's suffering. Every refusal to perform for Washington was costing them both flesh and strength and future. But there was also this: they'd preserved truth. Somewhere in the East, Catherine Whitmore was circulating their documentation. Journalists were asking questions, reform organizations were investigating. It might not change anything, probably wouldn't change anything. But at least the truth existed outside Thornton's control. That had to be enough, because it was all they had. Winter came harsh and early. Their cabin was inadequate against the cold, their rations insufficient for generating body heat. Neshoba developed a cough that wouldn't clear. Margaret's hands grew too numb for fine sewing, eliminating even the possibility of unofficial income. And still Thornton waited, watching them deteriorate, expecting eventual surrender. But something else was happening, invisible to Thornton's surveillance. The other Apache families, watching how Margaret and Neshoba were being punished for speaking truth, began sharing resources. Not openly. That would have drawn retaliation against them as well. But quietly, at night, food would appear at their door. Firewood would be stacked anonymously. Someone would repair a fence or patch a leak when Thornton's maintenance crews wouldn't. They weren't dying alone. And that made endurance possible. In January, nearly 6 months after their return from Washington, Catherine Whitmore's article appeared in Harper's Weekly. A detailed expose of conditions at Fort Defiance, complete with the documentation Margaret and Neshoba had provided. Names, numbers, testimony, everything Thornton had tried to hide, now public and permanent. The article caused outrage in reform circles. Questions were raised in Congress. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs was forced to order investigations into Fort Defiance's operations. It wasn't enough to fix the system, would never be enough to undo the damage of decades. But it was something. Acknowledgement that the official narrative was a lie. Evidence that could be used by future reformers, future fighters, future people who refused to accept comfortable fiction over uncomfortable truth. Major Thornton was reassigned to a smaller post in Wyoming, not punishment, exactly, but definitely demotion. His replacement, Major Carson, was younger, less invested in the previous administration's methods. Not kind. Kindness wasn't possible within the system they all served, but pragmatic. Less interested in elaborate control mechanisms than in basic functionality. Within weeks, Margaret and Neshoba's persecution eased. Not from mercy, but from Carson's different priorities. He didn't care about making examples or enforcing ideological purity. He just wanted his scouts working, and the fort running smoothly. "Your documentation caused significant problems," Carson said during their first meeting. "The Bureau is still dealing with congressional inquiries. Thornton's career is essentially finished." "Good," Margaret said without apology. Carson smiled faintly. "I'm not here to continue his vendettas. Frankly, I think the whole integration marriage program is misguided. Forcing people together never creates genuine cooperation. But I'm stuck administering it since the commissioner still believes it's valuable. So here's what I propose. You continue your marriage on paper, which satisfies Bureau requirements. I restore your regular rations and assign Neshoba real scouting work. And in return, you stop creating problems for me." Define problems, Neshoba said carefully. I don't expect you to praise policies you hate or pretend the system is just, Carson replied. I'm not that naive. But I do expect you won't actively sabotage fort operations or send more exposés to Eastern newspapers, at least not while I'm in command. It was more honest than any conversation they'd had with Thornton. No pretense of benevolence, just acknowledgement of the limits within which they all operated. We want the school to actually teach, Margaret said, not just indoctrination. Real education that gives children tools to navigate both worlds. Fine with me, Carson said. I'm a soldier, not a missionary. If you want to teach actual reading instead of just obedience, that's your business. And the rations? Neshoba asked. For everyone, not just us. The amount specified in the treaties versus what's actually distributed. Carson's expression hardened slightly. That's bureau policy, not my discretion. I can't change allocation formulas, but I can ensure what's allocated actually reaches the intended recipients instead of being diverted, which I suspect will still be an improvement over Thornton's administration. It wasn't justice. It was barely even fairness, but it was survivable. Over the following months, life at Fort Defiance settled into new patterns. Margaret returned to teaching, this time with Carson's permission to include Crow language instruction alongside English, acknowledging that children needed to navigate both cultural worlds. Neshoba resumed real scouting work, though he was careful now about what information he provided, conscious that every successful tracking mission made him complicit in hunting people who'd chosen resistance over surrender. The marriage remained what it had become, partnership born from shared trauma and common purpose. They shared the cabin, shared meals, shared the understanding that their bond had been forged in opposition to the system that created it. Whether that constituted love was a question neither quite asked aloud. But there were moments. Evenings when they'd work together translating Apache oral histories into written form, preserving stories the government wanted erased. Mornings when Margaret would wake to find Neshoba had already started coffee, a small consideration that spoke of care beyond mere cohabitation. Quiet conversations where they'd discuss what kind of future might be possible for children growing up between worlds. And slowly, carefully, something neither had expected grew between them. Not the forced intimacy Thornton had tried to create, but genuine connection built on respect and survival, and the stubborn refusal to let manipulation define their relationship. 2 years after the marriage, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with complicated emotions. Joy, certainly, the unexpected desire for this child. But also fear. Fear of bringing a child into a world designed to destroy them. Fear of giving the system another hostage to use against them. Fear that motherhood would mean new forms of surveillance, new mechanisms of control. What do we do? She asked Neshoba that evening. He was quiet for a long time, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. We raise a child who knows truth, he said finally, who understands both the Apache world and the white world, who can navigate between them without being destroyed by either, who knows they were chosen, not forced. That's a heavy burden for a child. All Apache children carry heavy burdens now, Neshoba replied. At least ours will carry it with parents who refuse to surrender. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret continued teaching until her body wouldn't allow it, then worked from the cabin preparing curriculum materials, while Neshoba took on extra work to compensate for her lost income. The fort's doctor, a new arrival who'd actually trained in medicine rather than being assigned as punishment detail, provided adequate care, though he made no secret of his disapproval of mixed marriages. These children never quite fit anywhere, he said during one examination. Neither world fully accepts them. You're condemning this baby to lifelong isolation. Or we're giving this baby the tools to build bridges, Margaret replied. Depends on your perspective. Perspective doesn't change reality, the doctor said. Then I suppose we'll have to change reality, Margaret shot back. Their daughter was born in early spring, during a dust storm that turned the sky orange and made breathing difficult. She emerged screaming her fury at the world. Dark hair, features that blended both parents, eyes that would eventually settle into something between Margaret's blue and Neshoba's brown. They named her Sarah, after Margaret's mother, and gave her the Apache name Nalnish, meaning she works, or she accomplishes. A child meant to create, not just survive. Major Carson visited 3 days after the birth, carrying an official-looking document. The Bureau needs birth registration, for census purposes. What will you record her as? Neshoba asked, knowing the weight of bureaucratic categorization. Carson hesitated. Policy says children of mixed marriages are classified by father's race, which would make her Indian. Which means what, practically? Margaret asked. Limited citizenship rights, restricted movement, subject to Bureau authority. Carson set down the document. But if I record her mother as sole guardian, classify her as white with Indian stepfather, she gets full citizenship, access to schools outside the reservation, legal rights Indians don't have. It was tempting, the chance to give Sarah options, freedoms her father would never have. But it also meant officially erasing half her identity, pretending her Apache heritage didn't exist or didn't matter. Record her correctly, Neshoba said, as mixed blood. She'll know what she is. We won't start her life with bureaucratic lies. You're limiting her future, Carson warned. I'm giving her truth, Neshoba corrected. She can decide for herself what to build from that. Carson recorded Sarah as Indian with white mother. And with that notation, her life's trajectory was largely determined by forces outside her control. But inside the cabin, away from bureaucratic classifications, Sarah was simply theirs. Margaret would sing to her in English, teaching her lullabies from her own childhood. Neshoba would speak to her in Apache, telling her stories about the world before reservations, before forts, before the long defeat. And Sarah grew, absorbing both worlds, belonging fully to neither. When Sarah was 6 months old, Catherine Whitmore returned to Fort Defiance. She'd continued her reform work, had become a nationally recognized advocate for Indian rights, had used the documentation Margaret and Neshoba provided to push for Bureau oversight reforms. I wanted to see how you were managing, Catherine said, sitting in their small cabin while Sarah slept in a cradle Neshoba had built. After everything you sacrificed to get that information to me. We're alive, Margaret said. That's more than many can say. The reforms helped, Catherine continued. Not enough, never enough, but some. Supply distribution is more carefully audited now. There's oversight on fort administration. The marriage program has been quietly discontinued for new arrangements. Discontinued because it failed or because it was exposed? Neshoba asked. Does the distinction matter? Yes, Neshoba replied. If they stopped because it didn't work, they'll try something else just as coercive. If they stopped because the cost of exposure was too high, then at least we accomplished something. Catherine considered this. I think it was exposure. The Bureau can't survive too many Harper's Weekly articles documenting their abuses, so they're being more careful now about which abuses they commit openly. It was a cynical assessment, probably accurate. What happens to the existing marriage contracts? Margaret asked. Like ours? Those remain in effect, Catherine said. The Bureau won't dissolve them, that would be admitting the program was forced. But they're not creating new ones. She paused. You could petition for dissolution if you wanted. I have contacts who could help. On grounds of coercion, false pretenses. No, both Margaret and Neshoba said simultaneously. Catherine looked between them with surprise and something that might have been understanding. You want to stay married, after everything? The marriage began as coercion, Margaret said. But it's become a choice. We're staying because we want to, not because anyone is forcing us. I see, Catherine said softly. Then I'm glad something good came from Thornton's manipulation, even if it wasn't what he intended. After Catherine left, Margaret and Neshoba sat together in the evening quiet, Sarah sleeping between them. Did you mean it? Neshoba asked. That you're staying by choice? Every day I wake up here is a choice, Margaret replied. I could leave, could take Sarah somewhere east where mixed families are less conspicuous, where she'd have more opportunities. But this is home. You're home. So yes, I'm choosing to stay. Neshoba reached for her hand, a gesture they'd grown into slowly over months and years of forced proximity, becoming genuine partnership. I choose to stay too. And not because leaving would destroy what remains of my position with the fort. Because building a life with you and Sarah matters more than any position could. It wasn't romantic declaration, wasn't poetry. But it was honest. And honesty, after everything, meant more than pretty words. They lived at Fort Defiance for 7 more years. Sarah grew into a fierce, curious child who spoke English and Apache with equal fluency, who learned to read from her mother's books and track from her father's teaching, who existed in the liminal space between worlds, and slowly learned to build her own world from that in-between place. Margaret continued teaching, watching generation after generation of Apache children navigate the impossible task of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to forced civilization. She documented when she could, preserved what knowledge the government would prefer erased, fought small battles against bureaucratic cruelty. Neshoba scouted when required, but carefully, always conscious of the line between necessary survival and active betrayal. He taught Sarah about Apache ways, about the world they'd lost and the pride they'd maintained despite everything designed to destroy it. The surveillance never entirely ended. Fort administration changed hands several times, each new commander bringing different priorities and different levels of oppression. But Margaret and Neshoba had learned to navigate the system, to protect each other through careful awareness of how their words and actions would be weaponized, to resist in ways that preserved their dignity without inviting destruction. In 1884, Congress passed new legislation allowing Indians who adopted civilized lifestyles to apply for citizenship. Neshoba qualified. He wore Western clothing, spoke English, worked within the government system. But accepting citizenship meant formally severing ties to tribal governance, accepting individual land ownership instead of communal holdings. "It's another trap," Neshoba said, reading the legislation. "They're trying to destroy tribal identity through law instead of force." "Will you apply?" Margaret asked. "No," Neshoba replied. "I've compromised enough for survival. I won't participate in my own cultural destruction for the reward of citizenship in a system designed to eliminate my people." "Even if it means Sarah can't inherit citizenship through you?" Neshoba looked at their daughter, now 7 years old and listening intently to conversations she was beginning to understand carried weight. "Sarah will forge her own path. I won't pave it with the bones of my ancestors." It was the right choice, and the costly choice, and the only choice compatible with dignity. In 1888, Margaret's brother, the one who'd helped circulate her original letters to newspapers, visited Fort Defiance. He'd become a journalist himself, writing about Western expansion and Indian policy, using his position to document truths the government would prefer hidden. "You could come back east," he told Margaret. "Bring Sarah. I have contacts in educational institutions who'd take her despite her mixed heritage. She could have opportunities." "She has opportunities here," Margaret interrupted. "Different ones. Harder ones. But genuine. She's learning to exist between worlds. That's a skill that might matter more in the long run than any Eastern education could provide." "You've become one of them," her brother said, not entirely approvingly. "I've become myself," Margaret corrected. "Just took a forced marriage and a decade of fighting institutional cruelty to figure out who that was." By 1890, the marriage that had begun as surveillance contract had endured longer than most voluntary unions. Margaret and Neshoba had built something real from the wreckage of manipulation, not despite the coercion, but through their refusal to let coercion define them. Sarah was 10 years old, poised between childhood and adolescence, between worlds, between identities. She'd grown up watching her parents navigate impossible circumstances with stubborn dignity, had absorbed lessons about resistance and survival that no textbook taught. One evening, helping Margaret prepare dinner while Neshoba repaired a harness outside, Sarah asked the question that had been building for years. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "After you learned the marriage was forced? Why not just leave?" Margaret set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "Because leaving would have meant letting the people who forced us together win. They wanted to use me to control your father, to make my words into weapons against him. If I'd left, if I'd let that manipulation succeed, then everything they did to us would have been justified." "But you didn't have to fall in love with him," Sarah continued, with the brutal honesty of children. "You could have stayed, but stayed separate. You're right, Margaret agreed. I didn't have to love him. That was a choice I made slowly, over time, as I watched him maintain dignity under circumstances designed to destroy it, as he watched me do the same. We chose each other after being forced together. That matters. Did he choose you? Why don't you ask him? Margaret suggested. That evening, Sarah asked her father the same question. Neshoba considered his answer carefully, as he did all things. I stayed because your mother was willing to sacrifice her own safety for truth, he said finally. Because she documented crimes when exposure meant punishment. Because she understood that silence was complicity and chose to speak even when speaking cost her. Those are the qualities I choose in a partner. That we were forced together initially doesn't change that I'm staying by choice now. But you didn't choose to marry her originally, Sarah pressed. No, Neshoba agreed. Originally I was trapped and angry, and certain she'd betrayed me. But original circumstances don't determine final outcomes. I chose to see her clearly once the lies were exposed. I chose to work with her instead of against her. And eventually, I chose to love her. Each of those was a separate decision. Sarah processed this, her mind working through the complex mathematics of coercion and choice. So marriage can be both forced and chosen? Ours was, Neshoba replied. Forced at the start, chosen at the end. And somewhere in the middle, it became real. It was the truth they'd lived. Messy, complicated, impossible to reduce to simple narrative, but real. In 1893, 15 years after the forced marriage, Major Carson, now Lieutenant Colonel Carson, promoted through steady competence rather than political manipulation, retired from military service. His replacement was younger, more ideological, more committed to the civilizing mission that previous generations had pursued with varying degrees of cruelty and failure. The new commander, Major Bradley, immediately began implementing stricter policies, more intrusive oversight of Indian households, more aggressive enforcement of cultural suppression, more emphasis on forcing adoption of American ways. One of Bradley's first actions was reviewing all the marriage certificates from the discontinued integration program. These arrangements were meant to demonstrate successful assimilation, Bradley announced at a fort-wide assembly. I want to see evidence that's actually occurring. Families will be subject to monthly inspections. Cultural practices incompatible with civilization will result in consequences. Margaret and Neshoba looked at each other across the assembled crowd. After 15 years of relative stability, the surveillance was intensifying again. That night, Sarah, now 13 and increasingly aware of the political landscape she navigated, asked what would happen. Bradley will try to use me against your mother, or your mother against me, Neshoba explained. The old pattern. If your mother speaks truth, I'm punished. If I maintain Apache practices, she faces consequences. It's how the system maintains control. Then don't give him anything to use, Sarah said with the confident problem-solving of adolescence. It's not that simple, Margaret replied. Simply existing outside their definitions is resistance enough to invite punishment. But Sarah had grown up watching her parents navigate these systems. She understood the mathematics of coercion in ways most children never had to learn. Then make the surveillance cost them, Sarah suggested. If Bradley wants monthly inspections, document everything he does. Every intrusion, every threat, every abuse of authority. Send it to Miss Whitmore. Make exposure the consequence of their oversight. It was risky. But it was also exactly the strategy that had worked before. Over the following months, Margaret resumed her old practice of careful documentation. Every Bradley inspection was recorded. His questions, his threats, his violations of basic privacy. Every incident of punishment or intimidation was noted, dated, described in careful detail. And Sarah, now old enough to understand the stakes, helped. She'd observe interactions her parents missed, remember details, contribute her own perspective on how Bradley's policies affected children at the fort school. They were building testimony again, preparing for the moment when exposure would matter. That moment came 6 months into Bradley's administration when he ordered Sarah to attend the boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the infamous institution designed to kill the Indian, save the man, through cultural destruction disguised as education. She's of age, Bradley said when Margaret and Neshoba protested. Indian children over 12 are required to attend federal boarding schools. Your daughter qualifies. She's been receiving adequate education at the Fort School, Margaret argued. Under your instruction, which hardly counts as civilizing education, Bradley replied. The girl needs to be removed from corrupting influences, meaning you, and properly trained in American ways. She leaves in 2 weeks. It was the threat they'd always feared. Separation. The government taking their child and using her as leverage to ensure compliance. No, Neshoba said quietly. No? Bradley repeated. You don't have the authority to refuse. This is federal policy. Then we'll challenge federal policy, Margaret said, publicly. With every documented abuse, every violation, every piece of evidence we've accumulated over 15 years of living under your surveillance system. Bradley's expression hardened. You're threatening a military commander? That's insubordination. Potentially treason. I'm promising to tell the truth, Margaret replied. If you send our daughter to Carlisle, every newspaper, reform organization, and congressional committee will hear exactly how integration families are actually treated at Fort Defiance, including how you've intensified surveillance, increased cultural suppression, and now attempt to forcibly separate families who don't comply with your ideological requirements. You have no proof. We have extensive proof, Neshoba interrupted. 15 years of documentation, including your own words from the past 6 months, witnessed, dated, detailed. Send Sarah to Carlisle, and it all becomes public. Bradley looked between them, recognizing the trap. He'd walked into the same situation Thornton had created, given them enough oppression to document, enough cruelty to expose, enough ammunition to make their silence costly. You're bluffing, Bradley said. Test us, Margaret replied. The standoff lasted 3 days. Bradley consulted with his superiors. Margaret and Neshoba prepared to send their documentation to Catherine Whitmore and every other contact they'd accumulated over the years. Sarah packed a travel bag, preparing for either Carlisle or emergency departure if the confrontation escalated to violence. Finally, Bradley summoned them to his office. I've received guidance from the Bureau, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Given the sensitivity of integration family situations, exceptions can be made to boarding school requirements if adequate education is provided locally. Your daughter will remain at Fort Defiance, for now. It wasn't victory, just temporary reprieve, but it was enough. However, Bradley continued, I want it understood that any further resistance, any more incidents, any additional problems from your household, and that exception disappears. Am I clear? Perfectly clear, Margaret replied. After they left Bradley's office, the 3 of them walked back to their cabin in silence. Only when they were safely inside did Sarah speak. That won't last, she said. He'll find another way to retaliate, another pressure point. Probably, Neshoba agreed. But we bought time, and time is all anyone gets in this system. Is that enough? Sarah asked. Just buying time? Just surviving one crisis after another? Margaret looked at her daughter, this fierce, intelligent girl who'd grown up in the shadow of surveillance, who understood systems of control better than most adults, who was beginning to realize the cage she'd been born into. Sometimes survival is all there is, Margaret said. Sometimes just refusing to be destroyed counts as victory. That seems like a low bar for victory, Sarah replied. Then you'll have to raise it, Neshoba said. Your mother and I fought the battles we could fight with the weapons we had. You'll have different weapons, different battles. Maybe you'll win things we couldn't. It was the truth and the burden, that each generation inherited the struggle, adapted the tactics, pushed the boundaries slightly further. Progress measured in inches, sometimes in millimeters, always purchased at cost. Sarah lived at Fort Defiance until she was 16, then left for a teaching college in Colorado that accepted students regardless of race. She carried with her 15 years of documentation about reservation life, about integration families, about the machinery of control disguised as civilization. She became a teacher, a writer, an activist. She used her liminal identity, neither fully white nor fully Apache, to bridge worlds her parents could never have navigated. she published accounts of reservation life that circulated widely, taught generations of students about the complexities of forced assimilation, fought bureaucratic battles that Margaret and Neshoba had pioneered. Margaret and Neshoba remained at Fort Defiance until age and exhaustion finally forced them to accept they'd done what they could. They'd preserved truth when silence was easier. They'd raised a daughter who refused to accept coercion as inevitable. They'd built a marriage on choice after having choice stolen from them. In 1905, 27 years after the forced wedding, Neshoba died of pneumonia, one last indignity of reservation life, where adequate medical care remained perpetually inadequate. Margaret stayed at Fort Defiance another year, then moved to Colorado to live near Sarah and her family. She lived to see the Citizenship Act of 1924, granting all Native Americans born in the United States full citizenship. Neshoba never got to see it, never got to witness the formal acknowledgement that his people were actually human beings with rights. But he'd lived refusing to wait for permission to be human, and that had mattered more than any legal recognition could. Margaret died in 1931, at 74 years old, surrounded by grandchildren who carried both her European ancestry and Neshoba's Apache heritage. Children who existed between worlds, not because they'd been forced there, but because their grandparents had refused to let forced circumstance become forced identity. Sarah spoke at her mother's funeral, telling the story of a forced marriage that became a chosen partnership, of a surveillance system designed to control that instead produced resistance, of two people who'd been made weapons against each other and chose to become allies instead. They were trapped, Sarah said, but they refused to let the trap define them. They were forced together, but they chose to stay together. And in that choice, that stubborn, defiant, impossible choice, they built something their oppressors never intended. They built love from coercion. They built dignity from humiliation. They built truth from lies. It wasn't a happy story, wasn't triumphant, was just the messy, complicated reality of surviving systems designed to destroy you while maintaining enough humanity to build something worth keeping. The marriage certificate that started it all, the document signed under duress, witnessed by men who saw people as political tools, survived in family archives, a reminder of how it began, but also of what it became. Because the beginning doesn't determine the ending. Coercion doesn't eliminate agency. And sometimes the most radical act of resistance is choosing to love what you were forced to accept. Margaret and Neshoba never claimed their marriage was perfect, never pretended the trauma of its origin didn't leave scars. But they claimed it was theirs, built from the wreckage of manipulation into something neither the government, nor Major Thornton, nor any surveillance system could define. And in the end, that was enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the systems that try to control us through the people we love, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment. Could you build something real from a beginning built on lies? Could you choose to stay in a relationship that started with coercion? The conversation matters as much as the story. Because surveillance contracts still exist. They just have different names now, different mechanisms, different ways of making one person responsible for another's compliance. But resistance still exists too, and the stubborn refusal to let control systems define our relationships. That remains possible. Always.